So Socrates and Euthyphro are outside the court. Euthyphro has announced that he knows what piety is, and that's why it's okay for him to bring this suit against his father, given his knowledge, and in fact it is the right thing to do to accuse his father of murder. Socrates says, I need to know what piety is. You must know. Euthyphro says, I do. Socrates says, tell me. Euthyphro says, I will. So we want to think about 4 questions as we proceed. What is Socrates' goal? He says it's to gain knowledge of piety. We might wonder if that is his goal. It certainly appears to be his goal, and if he has any other goals. And in thinking about that, we would want to think about whether or not Socrates is always sincere, or is he maybe sometimes ironic. Second broad question, related a little bit to that last irony, is what is Socrates' method? How does he go about trying to find out what piety is, and how is he interacting with Euthyphro? One thing that becomes clear immediately is that Socrates wants a definition, so we want to know what a definition is and why Socrates might want one. And then we'll see that when Euthyphro tries to define piety, it doesn't go so well, and there's a particular definition we're going to be focused on that has a problem that's called the Euthyphro problem. His third definition of piety is what all the gods love, and we'll see what that is when we get there. So let's start with thinking about definitions. So what might be a definition of humanity? Well, you might say, if X is an animal, then X is human, and if X is human, then X is an animal. Well, this is a pretty bad definition of humanity. Why? You might say, you could ask yourself. Well, polar bears, for example. Polar bears are animals, but they aren't human, and so that first part of that proposed definition, that's no good. Is it the case that if X is an animal and X is a human? Not always, sometimes, but not always. So that makes it a bad definition. Well, we might try to fix this definition up. How would we do that? Well, we'd say, look, what's one difference between polar bears and other animals and humans? I know, they all have 4 legs, we have 2. So maybe we can improve the definition like this. We'd say if X is a 2-legged animal, then X is human, and if X is human, then X is a 2-legged animal. So now polar bears, your dog, your cat, not a problem. They're not counterexamples anymore. Is this a good definition? No, still bad. Why? Well, birds, for example, right? There are lots of animals that are 2-legged, but are not human, and in particular, birds are the example. There is, however, an obvious difference between you and me on the one hand and birds on the other hand. They have feathers, we don't. So maybe we could improve our definition. We could say if X, or our attempt at a definition, if X is a featherless 2-legged animal, then X is human, and if X is human, then X is a featherless 2-legged animal. Well, that first part seems like it's getting closer, at least to being true. It's not, I can't think, at least off the top of my head, of any animals that are featherless and 2-legged, but aren't human. So that first one seems like it's true. Maybe it's not, but it seems like it's true. What about the second one? If X is human, X is a featherless 2-legged animal. Well, that can't be quite right because there are humans who don't have 2 legs. But, so it's definitely not fully accurate. But these are getting closer and closer to being true. They're not there yet, but they're getting closer. Nonetheless, Socrates would think we're going in the wrong direction. They still aren't a definition of humanity. Because even if they were both true, it wouldn't be the case that being human is being a featherless 2-legged animal. Those are different things, even if they always coincide. Even if they did always coincide, they don't, but even if they did, it still wouldn't be a definition, because it doesn't tell us what humanity is. In a definition, we should have human on one side, an equal sign, and then something else on the other side. And what that would say is what is common to all things that are human that makes them human. And being a featherless 2-legged animal is not what makes you human. It's something else. Maybe it's having certain DNA, maybe it's being a rational animal, or it's actually not quite clear how you would define what humanity is. You'd say, here's what it is to be human. But a definition, that's what it would do. It wouldn't just say, here's one thing that coincides with humanity. It would say, here's what humanity is. It would say, what is it that's common to all humans that makes them human? It's not enough to have these 2 if-then statements. So if we want a definition of piety, then we need to say piety is what? It's what is common. We'd say piety is blah, 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 and that blah, 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 whatever it turned out to be, it would be what's common to all pious things that makes them pious. And we wouldn't just know, oh, pious things are like this and non-pious things aren't. We know here's what piety actually is. And then we would know. And that would be important to have, Socrates thinks. For one thing, it would help him in his trial. He would be able to defend himself, hopefully. But also, he thinks that it would guide action. When he's talking to Euthyphro initially, he said, wow, isn't accusing your father of murder impious? Wouldn't you need to know what piety is to be sure that that was a good idea? In other words, to act piously, don't you need to know what piety is? And Euthyphro says, yes, I agree, and by the way, I do know what piety is. And I'll tell you. So, Socrates wants this definition because he thinks that he needs it to defend himself, but he also in general would need to know what piety is so that he could pursue piety. And we're going to see that he also actually thinks that if you did know what piety was, then you would always do the pious thing. So knowing these definitions, Socrates thinks is super important. You need it to act virtuously. You need the definitions of different virtues if you're going to act virtuously to pick out which action is virtuous. And also, if you did know which action is virtuous, then you would want to do it, and so you would do it. And so knowledge is going to be really central, wisdom for Socrates. So one thing we've seen, too, we can observe about the way this dialogue is unfolding, is that Socrates isn't really clearly putting forward his own views. He always asks Euthyphro, isn't this the case? And then Euthyphro always says yes. And only when Euthyphro says yes do they proceed. So Socrates is not so much advancing his own views as much as putting forward views that Euthyphro then agrees with. Socrates asks, is this true? And then Socrates will continue to ask Euthyphro questions. And so Euthyphro then says, well, let me tell you what piety is. He says, what's pious is precisely what I'm doing now, prosecuting those who committed injustice, and not prosecuting those, on the other hand, that's impious. Now Socrates, let's think about what he says in response to this statement that Euthyphro makes. Socrates doesn't disagree. He doesn't say you're mistaken. He says, I think these are just examples. You've told me this action is pious, and that action is not, but you haven't actually told me what piety is. I want to know, right? Didn't we agree that a definition is what would tell us what's common to all pious things that makes them pious? And Euthyphro has agreed to that, right? Socrates says, would this be a definition? Euthyphro says, yes, isn't that what a definition would be? And Euthyphro agrees. And so Socrates then says, hey, didn't we agree that a definition would tell us what's common? And haven't you just given me some examples? And so you haven't given me a definition. Isn't that right? Question. And Euthyphro says, oh, you're right. I haven't given you a definition. And so Euthyphro says, let me now then give you what we agreed was a definition, something that says what really is common to all pious things that makes them pious. And Euthyphro says, what's loved by the gods, that's what's pious, and what's not loved by the gods, that's what's impious. And now it looks like we're getting the right kind of thing. It's not an example, it's not these if-then statements, it's an identity with that is in the middle. Pious on the one hand, what's loved by the gods on the other hand. And so now maybe we have at least the right kind of statement. But Socrates asks, don't the gods disagree? And in Greek mythology, they certainly do. And so wouldn't some things be both pious and impious because they'd be both loved by the gods and not loved by the gods? And Euthyphro says, oh, you're right, they would be, the gods do disagree, and that would mean that there'd be some things that are both pious and impious, but something can't be both pious and impious, and so this is a bad definition. Let me try again, says Euthyphro. Although he's kind of getting annoyed a little bit, but he keeps going. He says, I've got it. What's loved by all of the gods is pious, and what's not loved by all of the gods, that's impious. So all of the gods love it, it's pious. If all the gods don't love it, it's not pious. If some do and some don't, it's in the middle. It's neither pious nor impious. And now we have, on the one hand, maybe we're getting close. But no, Socrates is not going to agree with this definition either. He's not going to accept it. He's going to think, does this really tell us what piety is? Is it actually a definition? And Euthyphro is going to end up agreeing, no, actually it's not a definition. Why is Euthyphro going to agree to that? That we will find out in our next and last video for this module.